Hello and welcome to the Political Brief. I'm Molly Hall.
And I'm Florence Villeneuve. Coming up in the show, France aims to tighten its immigration policy, but the planned reforms face opposition.
And a stand-up interview of President Macron gets smacked down by critics.
Plus, how rich is the French cabinet? We take a closer look in this week's show.
This week, France accepted a first group of refugees screened under an overhauled asylum policy. These first 19 people among the 3,000 from Africa and 7,000 people from the Middle East to be resettled in France over the next 2 years.
Now, the migrant crisis was back on front pages this week. France's daily Libération showed this striking photo of asylum seekers trekking through deadly conditions in the French Alps. You can see the title there, Les Sommets de la Honte, essentially the summit of shame.
That's right. Now, Emmanuel Macron's government wants to toughen France's immigration policy, but critics are warning it will fuel anti-migrant sentiment.
The bill is yet to be finalised, but for Gérard Collomb, his work is cut out. The French Interior Minister has been tasked with the thorny issue of overhauling the nation's immigration asylum policy, following the president's orders.
Je ne veux plus d'ici la fin de l'année.
By the end of the year, I do not want to have women and men on the streets, in the woods, lost.
Dans les bois ou perdus.
Emmanuel Macron wants to close these street camps. And to achieve this, the government is introducing a deterrent policy. The time spent in detention centres will be extended from 45 days to 90 days. And the number of places will be increased. And border police will be stepped up. The objective is to expel more so-called economic migrants. Opposition voices from the far left have denounced the move as repressive and say it does not get to the heart of the problem.
Concretely, this doesn't mean anything except even more misery. When I explained throughout the presidential campaign that people should be able to stay in their home countries, my ideas were called unrealistic. Does anybody have a more realistic option other than throwing people back in the sea?
Meanwhile, campaigners say what migrants urgently need is basic accommodation.
Today we have an interior minister who insists on sorting between the good and the bad migrants, the genuine and the fake asylum seekers. When you have an 8 or 10-year-old child on the streets with his family in the middle of winter, sometimes for several weeks, you shouldn't question if it is genuine or a fake migrant.
In 2016, France registered 85,000 asylum applications. More than 30% of those were approved.
Now, the National Front and the right-wing Les Républicains party have long criticized the low rate of deportations of those denied asylum. That being said, the number of people expelled from France rose by 14% in the first 11 months of the year. France's far-right National Front party reacted to the government's attention to the issue, saying it was a political victory.
That's right, but critics say the reforms could incite unrest at emergency shelters, pitting those with a realistic chance of asylum against economic migrants. The French government says that's not the goal.
It's simply about knowing who is in these centers. The unconditionality of the hosting is not called into question. The mobile teams won't include the police. They won't have the power to do identity checks, to kick people out on the street, if that is the legitimate concern of human rights advocates, which I understand.
Now, strong opposition has already prompted the government to announce it's watering down part of a new bill that's set to be debated early next year.
Now, the EU migrant crisis was largely sparked by the Syrian civil war. The French president addressed that issue when he appeared in his second primetime interview since taking office.
Mr. Macron took a major departure from his predecessor concerning Bashar al-Assad. François Hollande had insisted the Syrian president leave power.
I think between now and February, we will win the war in Syria. Bashar al-Assad will be there. He will be there also because he is protected by those who won the ground war, whether it be Russia or Iran. We cannot say that we do not want to carry out talks with him and his representatives. France's project in Syria is to ensure peace now, to clear the country of mines, to demilitarize it, and find a political solution which leads to lasting peace. We must speak to Bashar al-Assad and his representatives after, and he must answer for his crimes to his people and to international justice.
Now, this interview by public broadcaster France 2 has been getting a lot of attention, but not so much for the content, rather for the style. The journalist Laurent Delahousse and President Macron standing up, walking through the Élysée Palace.
Now, Molly, it's a very modern interview that critics say is also very old school, reminiscent of a time when journalists were perhaps too cozy with politicians. Delahousse has been taking a lot of flack on Twitter, essentially being accused of being too soft on the president.
That's right. We've got the Élysée correspondent for Reuters who called it deferential French journalism at its worst, saying one of the most hard-hitting questions in Macron's interview, quote, "Here's the Christmas tree in the courtyard. It's the end of the year. What do you want to tell the French? Don't be afraid."
Now, political opponents were quick to follow suit as well. You can see a tweet by a lawmaker from the far-left Unsubmissive France movement. You can see he tweeted this photo of shoes being polished. Now, in French, the expression cirer les pompes, to polish someone's shoes, means to lick someone's boots. Now, he ironically said that France thanked Delahousse for his, quote, pertinent question and signature irreverence that shines light on the truth when faced with the presidential monarch.
Well, next to a $1 million question many of you may be curious about, how wealthy is the government? Ever since 2013, the assets of French ministers have been published. President Macron's cabinet is no exception to the rule, and it turns out more than a third are millionaires, which is likely to feed criticism that Macron is the president of the rich. But the proportion is roughly the same as in the previous socialist government, which counted 14 millionaires among its 39 ministers last year.
Now, there's one minister who's been getting a lot of attention, and that's Environment Minister Nicolas Hulot. Now, he has assets totaling 7.2 million euros. That makes him France's second richest minister. And for a man on a mission to ban petrol cars and diesel guzzling cars, he's actually very fond of engine vehicles, combustion engine vehicles. He actually owns some 9 motor vehicles. You can see the list here. He has a Land Rover he keeps at his holiday home in Corsica, a 30-year-old 2CV, that's a deux chevaux in French, a Peugeot, a Citroën, a Volkswagen camper van. He also has a motorboat and a BMW bike. He has electric vehicles, it must be said. He has an electric BMW car and an electric scooter, like the one you can see in this photo from 2011.
Indeed, but critics have pointed out a certain hypocrisy from a man who says France will outlaw the sale of all petrol and diesel vehicles by 2040. But for his part, the environment minister brushed off any contradiction in an interview, saying, "I'm all for transparency, but I'm not for voyeurism or nitpicking." Hulot went on to say he travels in electric cars that belong to his ministry or on electric scooters 95% of the time.
Now, while the private finances of politicians are in the spotlight, so are their official expenses as well. The Prime Minister, Édouard Philippe, is in hot water for chartering a private aircraft earlier this month. The total cost, 350,000 euros.
Now, Philippe, along with a 60-strong delegation of officials, was returning from an official visit to the French Pacific territory of New Caledonia. Well, they took an Airbus A340 with first-class seats from Tokyo to Paris.
Now, officially, the Prime Minister needed to be back in Paris urgently because President Emmanuel Macron was leaving the country. But the private flight landed just 2 hours before the army plane they were supposed to take, which arrived in Paris almost empty.
Critics say it was a huge waste of public money at a time when French people are being asked to tighten their belts. Well, the Prime Minister defended his trip.
I take responsibility for this decision completely, and I want to explain it. It's complicated to move the Prime Minister around, and it's expensive. The whole trip to New Caledonia cost a lot more than 350,000 euros, but it was much cheaper, 30% cheaper than the exact same trip my predecessor took to New Caledonia.
The Prime Minister taking a jab there at his predecessor, Manuel Valls, whose trip in 2016 cost 2 million euros versus a total cost of 1.3 for the current Prime Minister.
Now, it's the end of an era for the Socialist Party in France. The cash-strapped socialists are selling their iconic headquarters on Rue Solferino in the very posh 7th arrondissement of Paris for 45.5 million euros. Now, this sale should help the party, which has been reeling since 2017's catastrophic presidential and legislative elections. Solferino has been the socialist base since 1981, the year that François Mitterrand was elected president. They have until September 2018 to pack up and leave, and currently are looking for a new headquarters.
And finally, Emmanuel Macron turned 40 this week, making many people in France question their life choices. The president celebrated in style at the Château Chambord, and as you might imagine, he drew some criticism for choosing such a regal location.
So happy birthday, Mr. President, and thank you for joining us on The Political Brief.